Hi everyone, this video is going to introduce you to the first major project in RIT 1120, which is the incident analysis. I'll go through and talk a little bit about what the project is all about, the prompt, nitty-gritty details on requirements and guidelines, and then some ideas for you as you get started with your writing process. So the incident analysis is a project that asks you to describe an experience. You're going to look at something that piques your interest, that gets you confused, that's troubling, that you feel like deserves an explanation or some kind of discussion, but it hasn't had a satisfactory answer. It can be an experience, a discussion, something that has happened to you, or just something that is somehow connected or relevant to your life and your identities. In writing, you're going to explore that experience or that problem and work to turn that into some kind of topic that can ultimately be investigated in your research proposal and annotated bibliography project, and then in your researched project. And I'll describe a little bit more about some ways to go about identifying a topic as this video goes on. So something to keep in mind as we get started on this first project is that the three major projects do connect. So whatever you choose to be discussing in your incident analysis will blend into your research proposal and therefore your researched project. So although your topic might shift a little bit, you might either expand or get more specific and narrowed as time goes on. It does need to be related. So you should choose something that you feel like can ultimately become your researched project in the end. Now, that's not something you have to have fully defined yet. That's the process we're going through with the writing. So don't feel like you have to identify a research question right now, a thing that you're going to explore, or somehow have an argumentative thesis figured out. The incident analysis is really designed to get us started and get you to start talking about this problem. It means that you don't have to have a fully defined project yet, but you should choose something that you think is researchable, that you think could ultimately become that researched project. So just to kind of describe a little bit more of how those projects are different and also how they relate. The incident analysis is sort of a narrative. It's about your personal experience with an issue and explores possible areas for research. And I'll describe that in a little bit more detail later in the video. Your research proposal and annotated bibliography is about proposing a specific research question about that issue to explore, and you don't know the answer yet. So it's something that you're curious about and you want to learn more. Your researched project is then ultimately responding to a specific research question about an issue using scholarly sources and your personal knowledge to support some kind of argumentative thesis. So these projects are all related and they ultimately kind of evolve as the semester goes on. So keep in mind that these projects are connected. You need to choose something right away that you think could ultimately become your research project. So how do we approach the incident analysis? Well, I like to think back to Savini when they write about providing us with a new way of seeing or thinking about something. So when you approach this writing task, you should consider the different identities and roles that you have in your day-to-day life. You should keep in mind that your goal is not to change the world in this paper or even to ultimately know what you're researching necessarily. Instead, just provide us with a new way of seeing or thinking. Start to break apart this topic and examine it from different angles. So to do that, in your paper, the first part of your paper should just describe an experience. So this might be something like a discussion you've had. Maybe it was an interaction with someone. Maybe it was something that happened to you or something that you've done. Any kind of experience. And you'll see in some of the samples that I've provided some different avenues that you could take to approach this. Then the second part of your project should be posing questions that you have about the experience and why it matters, as well as examining it from different points of view. So you might also, later in the paper, for instance, in your conclusion, brainstorm some possibilities for future research and discussion. This could be, you looking ahead to your next project and thinking about how it ultimately might become a researched project. Keep in mind that you don't have to have all the answers right now. This is just you brainstorming. It's getting some ideas out there that you might ultimately take up in your research. So the main part of this project, to reiterate, is describing an experience you've had that is somehow representative of something, that has gotten you thinking about something, and then posing questions and analyzing the different moving parts of that project. So what is analysis then when we're talking about doing analysis in our paper? Very basically, an analysis is a detailed examination of something. It's looking at all of the parts and the structure and organization of an issue, a text, a situation, whatever it is that you ultimately want to analyze. So for our purposes, you should be looking at the problem, or maybe even the event or incident that you're describing. You should think about the various moving parts, the structure, and the different things that are at play when we're talking about that problem. So some questions that might get you started are kind of the who, what, where, when, why kinds of questions that you often are prompted to ask about a situation. So the very first thing, of course, is what is the problem? Can you describe it a little bit? And this is kind of the first part of your paper where you're talking about what actually happened or what is happening that you're examining. Who are the stakeholders for this problem or situation? Who cares about this issue? Who's involved? Who does this problem impact or affect? There are lots of different stakeholders in almost any problem that we're talking about. You might think about it as people who are in power that might be able to make a change, as well as people who are impacted by that problem and maybe don't have as much power to make a change. All of those people are important to be considering. Then also be thinking about where this problem is occurring. And that might be something that's a geographical where, like the United States or Northwest Ohio, or it could be a more sort of figurative where. Maybe it's universities, maybe it's somewhere that's online. It could be a different kind of where. When this problem is occurring is also important. Now, this could be literally 2020, the 21st century, or it could be when certain factors come into play. So maybe when people are presented with an exam in a university class, they're getting test anxiety. Your when might be during examinations or during standardized testing in K through 12 schools. That could be a when. It just kind of depends on what your problem is, but thinking about the different factors that prompt a problem to occur, that where and when, can be really important to breaking it apart and analyzing it. It's also important to start thinking about how this problem is impacting the world we live in. And again, you might not have a completely well-defined answer to this yet because that might come up in your research a little bit more, but get a sense of how it's impacting you, how it has impacted you, and maybe hypothesize some possibilities here. These are all great things to be thinking about in that second part of your paper that also can lead you into your future research. So as we're writing this project, I want you to really keep in mind that your incident analysis is designed to help you learn about your issue. You don't have to have all the answers yet, and it's more about figuring out what the moving parts are of your project and what ultimately might lead to a research project. So as you're writing this project and designing it, I want you to think about two different kind of lists. First, consider Savini's 4 steps. So noticing, articulating a problem in its details, posing fruitful questions, and identifying what's at stake. And you'll notice with all 4 of those are kind of the factors that are ultimately going to come into play in your incident analysis. You've got to notice an issue. So this is the event or the incident itself that you're describing. Articulate a problem in its details. So that's the part where you're describing what the incident was, and also the stakeholders, when it occurs, where it occurs, the who, what, where, when, why, how questions. And then you're going to start posing fruitful questions and identifying what's at stake, kind of in that later part of your paper. This is where you're hypothesizing about why it matters, where your research might lead, and what ultimately you might want to investigate further. I also want you to be thinking about some learning goals as you're writing. So goals for this project are applying some curiosity to your writing. I want you to really be interested in the topic that you choose, and I want you to pick something to write about that you want to learn more about, genuinely. Not something that you think is going to make me happy as an instructor, something that you think that is going to lead to quote unquote a good paper. Instead, I want you to choose something that you ultimately would be excited about researching more and writing about, because we're going to be writing about it for the majority of the semester. So it's got to be something that can hold your attention. I also want you to be thinking about how you can demonstrate your openness to new ideas. And this is something we're going to be doing throughout the semester, is knowing that you might not have all the answers yet, and that you're going to have to look elsewhere and outward to ultimately help you understand this problem better. So that openness is also a factor. I find that that can be one of the hardest parts about doing projects like this, especially when it's something that's personal to you. And I've asked you to choose something as your topic that ultimately affects you and your identities, right? But keeping that openness in mind is really, really important as we go through and write and research. And then ultimately, practice some creativity in the approaches that you're using in your writing. And I want you to be open to choosing different methods for writing about it, open to experimentation, and taking some risks in your compositions as well. All right, so the nitty-gritty, the guidelines. For this project, you can choose to either write a paper or produce a digital equivalent. And that means something like a narrated PowerPoint or a video, kind of like this. It could be an audio essay, it could be a Twitter thread, it could be a photo essay. Almost anything really are possibilities. And if you have an idea and you aren't sure if it would work, just send me an email and let's talk it through and figure out a plan. If you're writing a paper, I'd like it to be at least 3 pages long. And if you're producing a digital equivalent, it should be at least 6 minutes long. And that's because that's kind of the standard equivalent exchange for a written paper to digital equivalent. And you'll notice that when we have the option to digital equivalents throughout the semester, that's sort of how the conversion works. So for your paper option, if you were going to write a paper, you would use MLA formatting and cite any sources that you're using. Now keep in mind that you don't have to have any sources in this project yet. We'll get to using sources later in the semester when we're doing our research. But if you do have any sources, they need to be cited appropriately. That means in-text citations and a works cited page for MLA formatting. If you need a refresher on MLA formatting, there are some resources available on our course site that you can check out. And you can also always contact me with any questions that you have. For the digital equivalent option, you need to include at least a title so that you've identified what your project is. And again, cite any sources you've used appropriately. Again, you don't have to have any sources in this project yet, but if you do use some, please cite them. And if you're using a video or an audio essay, you could do this verbally. You can identify where the source is coming from. You could also include a written sources page as you turn in your digital equivalent if that works as well. The thing that I want to leave you with is some guided questions if you've watched this video and you still aren't really sure what to be writing about, what topic you'd like to explore. Here are some questions to kind of get you started. And I encourage you to free write on any of these guided questions. So sit down and maybe set a timer for 10 minutes and try to just write for that whole time in response to this. Maybe read these guided questions and just kind of keep them in the back of your mind for a little while, but think about what conversations you have had lately where you've had to explain yourself, so a perspective or position you have. Or maybe think about a situation where you've been on the receiving end of that, where someone has done the explaining to you. So any conversations you've had where you've come away with a different perspective, or you've tried to offer someone else maybe a different perspective on an issue. When have you had a hard time understanding or relating to someone? So it could be a friend, a relative, an acquaintance, a stranger on the bus, somebody. And what bothered you and what differences between you made this difficult? So when was it hard for you to understand someone else's perspective or empathize or relate to them? And what was challenging about that? What is an issue that affects you? And does it feel like no one else is really talking about it? What issue does it feel like it's very personal to you and important, but no one else seems to get? Why do you think an issue like that is difficult for other people to understand? Or why do you think stakeholders kind of have to keep talking about this to other people? When have you thought, I can't believe this is still an issue, or I can't believe this is still a problem we're dealing with? And why do you think that problem hasn't been solved yet? That's a really great one to get you thinking about a potential topic. Or, and this is the final one of you had an initial reaction to someone or something that you've had to rethink or change over time. So this is asking you a little bit of a longer kind of reflection. What's something that you've had to evolve your thinking about and that you've really changed your perspective on? Where did your initial reaction come from and what changed your perspective? And this one I find is really challenging, but leads to some really interesting conversations and topics. So it asks you to do a little self-reflection. It asks you to be a little critical, perhaps, of your thinking, but it can lead you some interesting places. If you have any questions about any of this, always feel free to contact me and email me. You'll find more materials guiding you through this process on our course site, and I look forward to reading where your projects lead and sharing some writing and feedback with you throughout this process.